The blood-red sun hung low over the Wyoming plains as Victoria Galloway pressed her tear-stained face into her hands, her sobs muffled by the relentless howl of the prairie wind. The year was 1876, and everything she had ever loved had turned to dust, just like the dirt beneath her knees that swirled around her once fine dress. The stagecoach that had abandoned her hours ago was now just a distant memory, much like the life she'd left behind in Boston. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. "Those tears belong in my hands now," came a deep voice, rough as sandpaper but somehow gentle as rain. Victoria looked up, blinking away her tears to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. A cowboy atop a chestnut stallion, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment, terror gripped her heart. Out here, miles from civilization, a lone woman was as vulnerable as a newborn calf. "I mean no harm, miss," the stranger said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. He crouched before her, respectfully keeping some distance. "The name's Knox Northwood. And unless you're out here practicing your gardening skills, I reckon you might be in some trouble." The cowboy's eyes were startlingly blue against his sun-weathered face. Victoria estimated him to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30. His expression held no malice, only concern and something else, a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. I have nowhere to go," Victoria admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They took everything." Knox pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "Who's they, if you don't mind my asking?" Victoria took the handkerchief, noting the careful embroidery along its edge. Someone had taken time with this small token. "Bandits. They stopped the stage about 10 miles back, took our valuables, the horses." Her voice broke. "The driver and guard fought back. They didn't make it." Knox's jaw tightened. "And they left you out here to die." It wasn't a question. In this unforgiving land, abandonment was as good as a death sentence. "Not exactly," Victoria said, some strength returning to her voice. "I ran. When the shooting started, I just ran. I've been walking ever since, hoping to find the next station." "Which would be another 15 miles west," Knox said grimly. He looked to the horizon where the sun was rapidly disappearing. "Night's coming. You can't stay out here." He offered his hand. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. You can get cleaned up, rest, and tomorrow I'll take you to town." Victoria hesitated. Her mother's stern warnings about strange men echoed in her ears, but those warnings had been meant for crowded city streets and elegant drawing rooms. Out here, the rules were different. Survival trumped propriety. "I don't even know you," she said, but she found herself reaching for his hand anyway. "No, madam, you don't," he agreed, helping her to her feet. "But I give you my word as a man that you'll come to no harm under my roof. I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, who'll see to your needs. She's a proper old battle axe, make sure I behave like a gentleman." His smile was brief but genuine. Victoria nodded, feeling strangely calmed by this stranger's presence. "Thank you, Mr. Northwood." "Knox," he corrected, leading her to his horse. "Out here, formalities don't last long. May I know your name?" "Victoria Galloway," she replied, watching as he adjusted the stirrups for her. "Well, Miss Galloway," he said, helping her mount before swinging up behind her, "welcome to Wyoming territory, though I expect this isn't quite the welcome you anticipated." As they rode toward his ranch, Victoria felt the solid presence of the cowboy behind her. His arms encircled her without touching, holding the reins on either side of her waist. Despite everything, she felt safer than she had since leaving Boston. "I was supposed to stay with my uncle," she explained as the horse picked its way across the darkening landscape. "He has a cattle operation near Cheyenne. I came west because," she stopped herself. Her reasons seemed foolish now in the face of the day's violence. "Because," Knox prompted gently, Victoria sighed, "because I had nothing left in Boston. My father died last year. Debts I didn't know about consumed everything. The house, the business, all gone. My uncle offered me a place, said I could teach his children." Knox nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Starting over takes courage. Most people never try." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse almost soothing. Victoria found herself leaning back slightly, exhaustion overtaking her. Knox adjusted his position to support her weight. "It's not much farther," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest against her back. "Just over that ridge." When they crested the hill, Victoria saw lights glowing in the distance, warm and welcoming against the gathering darkness. As they drew closer, she could make out a substantial log house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. It was modest compared to the mansion she'd grown up in, but there was something solid and reassuring about it. "This is yours?" she asked, surprised at the size of the operation. "Mine and the bank's," Knox replied with a hint of humor. "Started with nothing 10 years ago. Now I've got 1,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, and more debt than I care to think about, but it's coming along." As they approached the house, a door opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the porch. A stout woman in her 60s stood framed in the doorway, arms crossed. "Knox Northwood, what in heaven's name are you doing bringing a lady home at this hour?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. Knox chuckled. "Told you about Mrs. Abernathy," he murmured to Victoria. Then louder, "Found this lady stranded, Mrs. A, stagecoach robbery. She needs our help." The older woman's demeanor changed instantly. She hurried down the steps as Knox helped Victoria dismount. "Good Lord, child, come inside this instant," Mrs. Abernathy said, taking Victoria's arm. "You're half frozen and white as a sheet. Knox, see to your horse and then bring in some hot water. I'll get a bath ready." Victoria found herself bustled into the warm house and seated before a blazing hearth in what appeared to be a comfortable sitting room. The furnishings were simple but of good quality: a horsehair sofa, several wooden chairs with cushions, a small writing desk in one corner. Bookshelves lined one wall, surprisingly well stocked. Mrs. Abernathy disappeared and returned moments later with a steaming cup of tea. "Drink this, miss." "Galloway, Victoria Galloway, Miss Galloway. This will warm you while I prepare your bath. Are you injured at all?" Victoria shook her head. "Just tired and scared." The admission came reluctantly. Mrs. Abernathy patted her shoulder. "You're safe now, dear." "Knox is many things, stubborn as a mule and hopeless with laundry, but he's a good man, one of the best." After a hot bath in a copper tub set up in a small guest room, Victoria changed into a nightgown and robe that Mrs. Abernathy had provided. "My daughters," the housekeeper explained. "She married a shopkeeper in Denver last year, left these behind." Clean, warm, and somewhat restored, Victoria made her way back to the sitting room where Knox stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He'd removed his hat and coat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He turned at her entrance. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much, thank you." Victoria sat in a chair near the fire. "Mrs. Abernathy said you've sent someone to alert the sheriff about the robbery." Knox nodded. "My foreman, Pedro, he's fast and knows the territory. Sheriff Jenkins is a good man. He'll organize a posse at first light." He hesitated. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Pedro to continue on to your uncle's ranch after seeing the sheriff. Let him know you're safe and will arrive in a few days." Victoria's eyes widened. "That's very thoughtful, but a few days." Knox sat in the chair opposite her. "The stage won't come through again until Wednesday. I'd take you myself, but I've got a cattle buyer arriving tomorrow who I've been trying to meet with for months." "Oh," Victoria felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. "Of course, I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Knox assured her. "Besides, after what you've been through, a few days' rest would do you good." Mrs. Abernathy appeared with a tray bearing 3 bowls of stew and a loaf of fresh bread. "Eat," she commanded. "Both of you. Miss Galloway looks like she hasn't had a proper meal in days." As they ate, Victoria found herself studying Knox covertly. There was something compelling about him, not just his physical appearance, though that was certainly striking enough. It was the quiet confidence he exuded, the sense of a man completely at ease with himself and his place in the world. "How long have you been in Wyoming?" she asked. "Almost 10 years now," Knox replied. "Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back." "You fought in the war?" Victoria asked, setting down her spoon. A shadow crossed Knox's face. "Confederate cavalry." Joined up at 18, spent 4 years fighting for a cause I didn't fully understand until it was too late. He looked down at his bowl. Not something I'm proud of anymore. Victoria was surprised by his candor. In Boston, the war was still a topic approached with caution in polite company. My father supported the Union, she said quietly, but he always said the true tragedy was that good men died on both sides. Knox's gaze met hers, something like gratitude in his eyes. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Victoria agreed, feeling a familiar pang of grief. He taught me that people are more than their worst mistakes or their greatest triumphs. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been silent during this exchange, nodded approvingly. That's gospel truth, that is. Now, both of you finish your supper. Miss Galloway needs her rest, and Knox, you've got that fence in the north pasture to see to at first light. After the meal, Knox excused himself to check on the livestock one last time, and Mrs. Abernathy showed Victoria to the guest room. It was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out over the prairie. If you need anything in the night, my room is just down the hall, the housekeeper said. Sleep well, dear. Victoria thanked her, then sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. She'd woken that morning in a hotel in Laramie, continued her journey east full of apprehension about her new life, and now found herself in the home of a stranger who had saved her from certain death on the prairie. She moved to the window, drawing aside the simple curtain. The moon had risen, casting silver light over the landscape. In the distance, she could see Knox walking back from the barn, his stride long and purposeful. He paused and looked up at the house, and for a moment, Victoria thought he might have seen her. Then he continued on, disappearing around the corner. With a sigh, she turned from the window and prepared for bed, wondering what the coming days would bring. The next morning, Victoria woke to the sound of activity outside her window. The sun was barely up, but the ranch was already alive with movement. Men on horseback drove cattle from one pasture to another, their calls and whistles carrying on the clear morning air. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Mrs. Abernathy had somehow managed to clean and press overnight, and made her way to the kitchen. The housekeeper was already there, kneading dough at a large wooden table. Good morning, Miss Galloway, she said cheerfully. Did you sleep well? Better than I expected, Victoria admitted. And please call me Victoria. Mrs. Abernathy smiled. Victoria, then. There's coffee on the stove and eggs keeping warm in the oven. Knox has been up since before dawn gone to check the herd before your cattle buyer arrives. Victoria helped herself to breakfast, then asked hesitantly, Is there anything I can do to help around here? I'm not used to idleness. The older woman looked pleased. Well, if you're offering, I wouldn't mind some help with the preserves. Got more strawberries from the kitchen garden than I can manage alone. Victoria spent the morning learning the art of making preserves under Mrs. Abernathy's patient instruction. It was hot, sticky work, but she found it oddly satisfying. By midday, they had filled a dozen jars with ruby-red preserves that gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. You're a natural, Mrs. Abernathy declared. Most city ladies would have given up after the first hour, Victoria laughed. I may have grown up in the city, but my mother believed in practical skills. She taught me to cook and sew before I learned French or piano. A sensible woman, the housekeeper nodded approvingly. Now let's get some lunch ready. Knox and that buyer should be back soon. They prepared a simple meal of cold chicken, bread, and the season's first tomatoes. Victoria was setting the table when she heard voices approaching the house. Through the window, she saw Knox walking beside a portly man in an expensive suit. Knox's expression was serious, but there was a hint of satisfaction in his stance that suggested the meeting was going well. The men entered, and Knox introduced the buyer as Mr. Harrington from Chicago. During lunch, the conversation centered on cattle prices and market conditions. Victoria said little, but she listened attentively, impressed by Knox's knowledge and business acumen. He spoke intelligently about breeding stock and grazing techniques, clearly passionate about his work. After the meal, the men retired to Knox's small office to finalize their agreement. Mrs. Abernathy, declaring she needed to rest her feet, went to her room for a nap, leaving Victoria to her own devices. She wandered into the sitting room and gravitated toward the bookshelves. The collection was eclectic practical manuals on animal husbandry and agriculture, histories of the American West, several volumes of poetry, and a surprising number of novels. She selected a copy of The Last of the Mohicans and settled into a chair by the window. Victoria was several chapters in when Knox found her an hour later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her before clearing his throat. "Good book?" he asked, entering the room. Victoria looked up with a smile. "Very. I'm surprised to find such a well-stocked library in a ranch house." Knox shrugged, taking a seat across from her. "Winter nights are long out here. Reading helps pass the time." He nodded toward the book in her hands. "Cooper gets some things wrong about Indian life, but he tells a good story. Your meeting went well?" Victoria asked, marking her place and setting the book aside. "Better than expected. Harrington agreed to take 200 head at $12 each. That'll keep the bank happy for another season." Knox's expression was one of cautious relief. "He's gone to town now, but he'll be back tomorrow to oversee the selection." "Congratulations," Victoria said sincerely. "That must be a weight off your shoulders." Knox nodded, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "Mrs. tells me you've been making yourself useful." "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Victoria replied. "I've never been comfortable being idle. Besides, it was nice, normal. After yesterday, I needed that." Something in Knox's expression softened. "I understand. After the war, I craved normalcy more than anything. Just everyday tasks that didn't involve death or destruction." "Is that why you came west?" Victoria asked. "To find peace," Knox considered this. "Partly, also to find purpose. The war took 5 years of my life, the years when most men figure out who they are and what they want to do. When it ended, I felt lost. And did you find it purpose?" "I think so," Knox said, gesturing toward the window and the ranch beyond. "Building something from nothing, creating instead of destroying, it feels right." Victoria nodded, understanding perfectly. "That's what I'm hoping to find with my uncle, a way to be useful, to build something new." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment until Knox stood. "I should get back to work. Those cattle won't sort themselves." He paused at the door. "Would you like to see the ranch later?" "I could show you around before dinner." Victoria smiled, surprised by how much the offer pleased her. "I'd like that very much." Late that afternoon, Knox took Victoria on a tour of his property. She rode a gentle mare named Daisy while Knox mounted his chestnut stallion Thunder. They rode first to the cattle pens where ranch hands were separating the animals Harrington would purchase. "Most of these were born and raised right here," Knox explained with pride. "Good stock, strong and healthy." They continued to the creek that provided water for the ranch, then up a gentle slope to a ridge overlooking the property. Knox dismounted and helped Victoria down from her horse. The view was spectacular, rolling grassland stretching to distant mountains. The ranch buildings nestled in a small valley, cattle dotting the green pastures. "It's beautiful," Victoria breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Worth every callous and sleepless night," Knox agreed, tying the horses to a nearby tree. He spread his coat on a flat rock and gestured for Victoria to sit. "Best view in Wyoming territory, if you ask me." As they sat side by side, Victoria felt a curious sense of belonging. This wild, open country was nothing like the ordered streets and cultivated gardens of Boston, yet something about it called to her soul. "Tell me about your home," Knox said. "What was Boston like?" Victoria described the city of her birth, the cobblestone streets, the grand houses of Beacon Hill, the bustle of the harbor. "It's beautiful in its way, but constrained. Everything has its place, everyone has their role." "And what was your role?" Knox asked. Victoria laughed without humor. "To marry well and continue the family legacy. At least that was my father's plan before he died and we discovered he'd lost everything." "I'm sorry," Knox said quietly. "Don't be." In a strange way, it was liberating. Suddenly, all those expectations fell away. "For the first time in my life, I could choose my own path." She looked out over the landscape. I never imagined that path would lead here, though. Knox studied her profile, admiring the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. Do you regret it, coming west? Victoria considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. Even after yesterday, no, there's an honesty to this place. It may be harsh, but it's real. Knox nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They sat in companionable silence, watching as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. We should head back, Knox said reluctantly. Mrs. O will have dinner waiting. As they rode back to the ranch, Victoria found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. In just a day, Knox Northwood had defied all her preconceptions about Westerners. He was educated, thoughtful, and possessed a quiet dignity that she found increasingly attractive. Over dinner, Mrs. Abernathy regaled them with stories of the early days of the ranch. You should have seen it, she told Victoria. Nothing but a one-room cabin and more dreams than sense. I told him he was crazy when he hired me to keep house. Why did you stay? Victoria asked. The older woman's eyes softened as she looked at Knox. Because I recognized something in him, determination, decency, the same qualities I saw in my late husband. She patted Knox's hand. Besides, somebody had to make sure he ate something besides beans and bacon. After dinner, they gathered in the sitting room. Mrs. Abernathy worked on her mending while Knox read aloud from a volume of Tennyson's poetry. His deep voice gave the verses a resonance that Victoria found mesmerizing. When he finished Ulysses, she requested Locksley Hall, and he obliged, his eyes occasionally meeting hers over the pages. It was, Victoria realized, the most pleasant evening she'd spent in a very long time. There was a simplicity to it, a warmth that had been missing from the formal gatherings of Boston society. The next day passed in similar fashion. Victoria helped Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks in the morning, then accompanied Knox to watch as Harrington's men began driving the purchased cattle toward the railroad at Cheyenne. The buyer himself came to the house for lunch, and Victoria was amused to see how her presence subtly altered his behavior. He was more formal, less prone to the colorful language he'd used the previous day. After Harrington departed, Knox suggested another ride. This time, he took Victoria to a hidden valley where a small herd of wild horses grazed. They watched from the shelter of a grove of cottonwoods as the magnificent animals moved across the landscape. They're incredible, Victoria whispered, entranced by their freedom and beauty. They are, Knox agreed. I've never had the heart to catch them, though I could use the extra stock. They belong to themselves. On the ride back, they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream. Victoria removed her boots and stockings and dangled her feet in the cool water. Knox, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. Tell me about your family, Victoria said. Are your parents still living? Knox shook his head. Both gone. Father died when I was 14, kicked by a horse. Mother followed 3 years later, influenza. His expression was somber but resigned. I have a younger sister, Catherine. She lives in St. Louis with her husband, has 2 little ones now. Do you see her often? Not as often as I'd like. Last visit was 2 years ago. Knox picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. What about you? Any siblings? Victoria sighed. A brother, Edward. He went to California during the gold rush in '49. We received letters for a few years, then nothing. Father hired someone to look for him in '55, but she shrugged. We never learned what happened to him. Knox's hand covered hers briefly in a gesture of sympathy. The touch, though fleeting, sent warmth spreading up Victoria's arm. She found herself wishing he hadn't pulled away so quickly. That evening after dinner, Knox excused himself to finish some paperwork. Victoria helped Mrs. Abernathy with the dishes, then retired to the sitting room with her book. She was deeply engrossed when she heard the front door open and close. Looking up, she saw Knox standing in the doorway, an odd expression on his face. Is everything all right? She asked, setting aside her book. Pedro's back, Knox said. He brought news from your uncle. Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety. What is it? Is something wrong? Knox came to sit beside her on the sofa. I'm afraid so. Your uncle's ranch was hit by raiders 3 days ago. Cheyenne breakaways, according to Pedro. They burned the outbuildings and ran off most of the stock. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Was anyone hurt? Your uncle was wounded shot in the shoulder, but he'll recover. They've moved the family into town for safety. Knox hesitated. Victoria, he sent a message asking you to delay your arrival. He can't take you in right now. Not until they rebuild and it's safe to return to the ranch. The news hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed plans crumbled in an instant. I see, she said faintly. Did he say how long? Knox shook his head. No. But rebuilding takes time, and there's still the matter of safety. The army's been alerted, but he didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew the army's response could be slow and ineffective. Victoria stared at her hands, trying to process this latest setback. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice small. I have no money for a hotel, no way to support myself until my uncle can take me in. You'll stay here, Knox said firmly. Victoria's head snapped up. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will, Knox interrupted. At least until we figure something out. I won't turn you out with nowhere to go. But it's not proper, Victoria protested weakly. Even as relief washed over her, Knox's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Mrs. Abernathy is a more effective chaperone than half the matrons in Boston, I'd wager. Your reputation is safe. Victoria knew she should argue further, but the prospect of having more time at the ranch, more time with Knox, was too tempting to resist. Thank you, she said simply. I'll find a way to repay your kindness. No need, Knox replied, rising. Now I should let you get some rest. We can talk more in the morning. As Victoria prepared for bed that night, her emotions were in turmoil. She was worried for her uncle and disappointed that her plans had been disrupted, but beneath those feelings was an undeniable current of what? Relief. Anticipation. Whatever it was, it centered on the tall cowboy who had found her crying in the dust just 2 days ago. She fell asleep, thinking of blue eyes and a deep voice reading poetry. The next morning at breakfast, Knox outlined a plan. The stage comes through tomorrow. I'll ride into town with you and speak to Sheriff Jenkins. He might know of a respectable family looking for a teacher or companion. If not, Mrs. Patterson at the hotel always needs help. Victoria nodded, though the prospect of working at the hotel held little appeal. That sounds sensible. Mrs. Abernathy snorted. Nonsense, the girl stays here. Knox and Victoria both turned to look at the housekeeper in surprise. Mrs. A. Knox began. Don't Mrs. A. me, Knox Northwood, the older woman interrupted. This house needs a woman's touch, and I'm not getting any younger. Miss Victoria has already proven herself handy in the kitchen and quick to learn. Besides, she added with a pointed look at Knox, having a lady around might encourage you to wash more often and mind your language. Victoria bit her lip to hide a smile as Knox's ears reddened. I don't want to impose, she said. It's not imposing if you're earning your keep, Mrs. Abernathy declared. And don't pretend you wouldn't be glad of the company, Knox. You've been talking to those cattle for too long. Knox cleared his throat. If Victoria wants to stay, she's welcome. But it should be her choice, not ours. Both of them looked at Victoria expectantly. She considered her options. Working at the hotel would mean independence, but also long hours of drudgery among strangers. Staying here? The thought sent a pleasant warmth through her chest. I'd like to stay, she said finally, if you're sure I can be useful. Knox's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. That's settled then. You'll stay until your uncle is ready for you or until you find something better. I'll need to go to town anyway, Victoria pointed out. I have nothing with me but the clothes I'm wearing. We'll go tomorrow, Knox agreed. Make a list of what you need and we'll see to it. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Mrs. Abernathy showed Victoria around the house more thoroughly, explaining the daily routines and weekly tasks. Victoria found herself genuinely interested in learning how the ranch household functioned so different from the formal, servant-filled home she'd grown up in. That evening, Knox surprised her by producing a fiddle after dinner. Mrs. A mentioned you play piano, he said. I thought you might enjoy some music. His playing was untrained but spirited, and Victoria found herself tapping her foot to the lively tunes. Mrs. Abernathy hummed along, occasionally breaking into song for the ones she knew the words to. When Knox played a waltz, the housekeeper nudged Victoria. "Go on, girl, dance with him. These old bones won't keep up with that tune." Victoria hesitated, but Knox was already setting aside his fiddle and extending his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Galloway?" She placed her hand in his, feeling a flutter in her stomach as his fingers closed around hers. He led her to the center of the room, where they had cleared space by pushing the furniture against the walls. His hand at her waist was firm but respectful, his other hand warm around hers. Knox proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer. They moved around the small space in perfect harmony, as if they had danced together 100 times before. Victoria was acutely aware of his nearness, the clean scent of him, the way his eyes never left her face. When the imaginary music ended, they stood still for a moment, neither wanting to break the connection. Finally, Knox stepped back, releasing her waist but keeping hold of her hand just long enough to bow over it. "Thank you," he said, his voice a touch lower than usual. "The pleasure was mine," Victoria replied, flustered by the intensity of her own response to the simple dance. Mrs. Abernathy, who had been suspiciously silent, suddenly yawned loudly. "Well, these old bones need rest. Don't stay up too late, you two." With a knowing smile, she left the room. Left alone, Victoria and Knox stood awkwardly for a moment. Then Knox gestured to the sofa. "Would you like to continue our reading? I believe we were in the middle of Locksley Hall." They sat side by side, closer than was strictly necessary, as Knox read Tennyson's romantic verses. Victoria was only half listening, distracted by the deep timbre of his voice and the occasional brush of his arm against hers. When he finished the poem, Knox closed the book but didn't set it aside. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you're under no obligation to stay here. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or wish to leave, just say the word." Victoria turned to face him, touched by his concern. "I know that, Knox. I'm staying because I want to." Their eyes met, and Victoria felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings that had been building since the moment he found her on the prairie. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, Knox stood, putting a respectable distance between them. "Good night, Victoria," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night," she replied, watching as he left the room. Only when she heard his footsteps on the stairs did she release the breath she'd been holding. The next day, they rode to town together. Juniper Creek was small but growing, with a main street boasting a general store, hotel, bank, sheriff's office, and several saloons. People nodded respectfully to Knox as they passed, and Victoria noticed more than a few curious glances directed her way. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Victoria sent a message to her uncle expressing sympathy for his troubles and informing him of her arrangements. Then they visited the general store, where Knox insisted on advancing her the money for several practical dresses, undergarments, and toiletries. "Consider it a loan," he said when she protested. "You can repay me from your first wages." As they were leaving the store, a well-dressed woman approached them. "Knox Northwood, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" Her tone was friendly, but Victoria detected an undercurrent of something else, possessiveness, perhaps. "Miss Elizabeth Porter, may I present Miss Victoria Galloway," Knox said formally. "Miss Galloway, Miss Porter's father owns the bank." Elizabeth Porter was beautiful in a carefully cultivated way, golden hair arranged in fashionable curls, an expensive dress that highlighted her trim figure. She extended a gloved hand to Victoria. "Charmed, I'm sure. Are you visiting our little town long?" Before Victoria could answer, Knox spoke. "Miss Galloway will be staying at my ranch for the foreseeable future. She's helping Mrs. Abernathy with the household." Elizabeth's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. "Indeed, how domestic." She turned her attention fully to Knox. "Will we see you at the Founders' Day dance next Saturday? Father has been hoping to discuss that loan extension with you." Knox nodded. "I'll be there. Business matters shouldn't wait." "Wonderful." Elizabeth's smile was dazzling. "Perhaps Miss Galloway would like to attend as well. It's quite the social event of the season." "That's very kind," Victoria said, finding her voice at last. "I'd be delighted to attend." Then it's settled, Elizabeth said, though her smile had cooled several degrees. Until Saturday, then, Knox. She nodded to him and swept away, her skirts rustling importantly as they continued down the street. Victoria glanced at Knox. She seems fond of you, Knox sighed. Elizabeth Porter has decided I would make an acceptable husband. Her father owns half the county, including the mortgage on my ranch. I see, Victoria said, trying to ignore the pang of jealousy that statement provoked. And what do you think of her? Knox was quiet for a moment. She's accomplished, beautiful, and would bring financial security to the ranch. It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. Their final stop was the sheriff's office, where Knox introduced Victoria to Sheriff Jenkins, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He took her statement about the stagecoach robbery, confirming that they had found the bodies of the driver and guard but no sign of the bandits. "I'm sorry about your experience, Miss Galloway," the sheriff said, "but glad Knox found you when he did. Not many would have survived a night on the prairie alone." As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Victoria felt a curious mix of emotions. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was starting a new life in this wild place, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew but was increasingly drawn to. "You're quiet," Knox observed as they crested the ridge overlooking the ranch. Victoria smiled wryly. "Just thinking about how quickly life can change. A week ago, I was in Boston packing my trunks, certain of my future. Now here I am, with nothing but a few new dresses and more questions than answers." Knox reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her. "Are you having second thoughts?" Victoria considered the question, then shook her head. "No, strange as it may seem, I feel, right here, as if this is where I'm meant to be, at least for now." The look Knox gave her was so full of warmth that Victoria felt it like a physical touch. "I'm glad," he said simply, and they continued down to the ranch in companionable silence. The next few days established a routine. Victoria rose early, helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast for Knox and the ranch hands. After the men left for their day's work, she assisted with household tasks, churning butter, baking bread, mending clothes. In the afternoons, she often rode out with Knox to check on the cattle or fences, learning about ranch operations with genuine interest. The evenings were her favorite time. After dinner, the three of them would gather in the sitting room. Sometimes Knox would play his fiddle or read aloud. Other times they simply talked, sharing stories and opinions. Victoria found herself opening up about her life in Boston, her fears for the future, her hopes and dreams. In turn, Knox spoke of his experiences during and after the war, his struggles to establish the ranch, his vision for its future. Mrs. Abernathy, Victoria noticed, often found reasons to leave them alone for increasingly long periods. The housekeeper's matchmaking intentions were transparent, but Victoria couldn't bring herself to mind. Those quiet moments with Knox were precious to her, moments when the connection between them seemed to strengthen with each shared confidence, each exchanged smile. By the time Saturday arrived, Victoria was keenly aware that her feelings for Knox had deepened into something far more significant than gratitude or friendship. Whether he felt the same remained uncertain. He was unfailingly kind and attentive, but also scrupulously respectful, never overstepping the boundaries of propriety. The Founders' Day dance presented a new challenge. Victoria had brought one good dress from Boston, a deep blue silk that had survived the stagecoach robbery, in her small valise. Mrs. Abernathy helped her prepare, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant style and lending her a cameo brooch to adorn the neckline. "You look beautiful," the housekeeper declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Knox won't know what hit him," Victoria blushed. "Mrs. Abernathy, I don't think—" "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted. "I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Like a man who's found water after crossing a desert." Before Victoria could respond, they heard Knox's footsteps in the hallway. He knocked lightly on the door, and Mrs. Abernathy opened it with a flourish. "Doesn't she look a picture?" the housekeeper asked proudly. Knox stood motionless, his eyes taking in Victoria's appearance. He had dressed carefully for the occasion in black trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a dark coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. "You look," he began, then seemed to lose his train of thought. "That is, the blue suits you very well." Victoria smiled, pleased by his reaction. "Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself." Mrs. Abernathy rolled her eyes at their formality. "Go on, you two, don't keep half the county waiting." The town hall was decorated with bunting and wildflowers for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the assembled townsfolk. A small band played in one corner, and refreshment tables lined the far wall. As Knox and Victoria entered, heads turned. Victoria was conscious of the curious stares and whispered comments. Clearly, her arrival with Knox Northwood was causing a stir. Elizabeth Porter approached immediately, resplendent in a pink gown that must have cost more than most of the townspeople earned in a year. "Knox, you came. And Miss Galloway, how lovely to see you again." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I must introduce you to everyone." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Victoria met the doctor and his wife, the minister, the blacksmith, and dozens of ranchers and townspeople whose names blurred together. Through it all, Knox remained at her side, his hand occasionally resting lightly at the small of her back, a gesture that sent warmth spreading through her. When the dancing began, Knox led Victoria onto the floor for the first waltz. As they moved together, Victoria was acutely aware of the eyes following them. "Everyone is watching us," she murmured. Knox's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "They're watching you." "It's not every day a beautiful, educated Easterner appears in Juniper Creek." "I think they're more interested in seeing me with you," Victoria countered. "Several ladies have given me looks that could curdle milk." Knox chuckled. "Ignore them, I am." After their dance, Knox was drawn away by Mr. Porter for what appeared to be a serious conversation. Victoria found herself surrounded by curious women, all eager to learn about the stranger staying at the Northwood Ranch. "It must be so difficult for you, coming from Boston to our little town," said Mrs. Davis, the doctor's wife. "Such a change in circumstances." Victoria recognized the probing for gossip beneath the sympathetic tone. "It's certainly different," she acknowledged. "But there's a beauty to this country that grows on one." "And how long will you be staying with Mr. Northwood?" asked another woman, her emphasis making the question sound vaguely improper. "Until my uncle's ranch is rebuilt," Victoria replied calmly. "I'm fortunate that Mr. Northwood and Mrs. Abernathy have been so kind." "Yes, Knox has always had a soft spot for strays," Elizabeth Porter said, joining the circle. "It's one of his more endearing qualities." Her smile was saccharine. "Though I must say, he's never brought one to the Founders' Day dance before." Victoria felt her cheeks warm at the thinly veiled insult, but before she could respond, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Miss Galloway is my guest, Elizabeth, not a stray." Knox's tone was pleasant but firm as he rejoined the group. "And now, if you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance." He led Victoria back to the dance floor for a lively reel. As they separated and came together according to the steps of the dance, Victoria couldn't help but laugh at the sheer joy of the movement. "Thank you for the rescue," she said when they were briefly together. Knox smiled, his eyes never leaving hers even as they moved apart again. "My pleasure. Though you seem to be holding your own." When the dance ended, they were both flushed and breathless. Knox guided Victoria to the refreshment table and procured glasses of punch for them both. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked, watching her over the rim of his glass. "Very much," Victoria replied honestly, "though I suspect I've made an enemy in Miss Porter." Knox grimaced. "Elizabeth has expectations. I've never encouraged them, but her father is an influential man." "And he holds your mortgage," Victoria remembered. "Did your conversation go well?" "Well enough. He's extended the loan for another 6 months. Knox's expression was carefully neutral. "At a higher interest rate, of course." Victoria sensed there was more to the story, but before she could ask, the band struck up another waltz. This time, however, Elizabeth Porter appeared at Knox's elbow. I believe you promised me this dance, Knox, she said, her tone making it clear that refusal was not an option. Knox glanced at Victoria apologetically. Will you excuse me? Of course, Victoria said graciously, though her heart sank as she watched Knox lead Elizabeth onto the floor. Left alone, Victoria sipped her punch and observed the dancers. Knox moved stiffly with Elizabeth, his posture formal, nothing like the natural ease he'd shown when dancing with Victoria. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was speaking intently, her perfectly coiffed head tilted up toward Knox's face. Miss Galloway. A tentative voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a young man in his early 20s, hat in hand, looking nervous but determined. I'm Daniel Cooper. My pa owns the livery stable. Would you care to dance? Victoria smiled at the young man's courage. I'd be delighted, Mr. Cooper. Daniel proved to be a competent, if somewhat enthusiastic dancer. As they moved around the floor, he peppered Victoria with questions about Boston and her journey west. She answered politely, all the while aware of Knox and Elizabeth across the room. When the dance ended, Daniel escorted Victoria back to the edge of the floor, only to be replaced by another would-be partner. For the next hour, Victoria found herself in constant demand, dancing with what seemed like every unmarried man in the county. It was during a brief respite that Sheriff Jenkins approached her, a serious expression on his weathered face. Miss Galloway, might I have a word? He asked, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the hall. Puzzled, Victoria followed him. Is something wrong, Sheriff? Jenkins hesitated. Not wrong, exactly, but I thought you should know we caught one of the men from the stagecoach robbery. He was trying to sell a distinctive pocket watch in Cheyenne that belonged to the guard. Victoria's heart raced. Did he? Has he said anything about the others? He's talking plenty to save his own neck, Jenkins confirmed. Says there were 3 others, led by a man named Harlan Reese. Bad reputation, that one. They're likely heading south toward Colorado territory. I see, Victoria said, a shiver running through her despite the warmth of the room. Thank you for telling me. There's more, Jenkins added. The prisoner mentioned they took a woman's valise that contained some valuable jewelry. Would that be yours, madam? Victoria nodded. My mother's pieces, not terribly valuable in terms of money, but they were all I had left of her. The sheriff's expression softened. I'll keep an eye out, Miss Galloway. If we recover them, they'll be returned to you. As Jenkins moved away, Victoria found herself trembling slightly. The reminder of that terrible day on the prairie, of how close she had come to death, was unsettling. Victoria. Knox was suddenly beside her, concern etched on his features. What's wrong? You've gone pale. She explained what the sheriff had told her, watching as Knox's expression hardened. Harlan Reese, he repeated, his voice grim. I know of him. He's rustled cattle from ranches up and down the territory. The sheriff seems to think they're long gone, Victoria said, trying to sound reassured. Knox nodded, but she could see he wasn't entirely convinced. Let's hope so. He offered his arm. Come, the last dance is starting. I'd like to claim it, if you're willing. Victoria placed her hand on his arm, feeling safer immediately. I'd like that very much. As they moved onto the floor for the final waltz, Victoria was aware of Elizabeth Porter's venomous stare from across the room. But with Knox's arms around her, the music flowing over them, she found it hard to care about anything else. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The moon lit their way, casting long shadows across the prairie. As they approached the ranch, Knox suddenly reined in his horse. Victoria, he said, his voice low and serious, there's something I need to say. Victoria's heart quickened. Yes, Knox hesitated, then seemed to change his mind. Just be careful around Elizabeth Porter. She's not someone you want as an enemy. Disappointment washed over Victoria. Whatever she had hoped he might say, a warning about Elizabeth Porter, wasn't it? I'll keep that in mind, she replied, unable to keep a hint of coolness from her tone. Knox looked as if he wanted to say more, but in the end, he simply nodded and urged his horse forward. When they reached the ranch, Knox helped Victoria down from her horse. Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. In the moonlight, his eyes were impossibly blue, his expression unreadable. Thank you for tonight, Victoria said softly. I enjoyed myself very much. As did I, Knox replied. More than I have in a long time. They stood there, the night air humming with unspoken words. Then, slowly, Knox raised his hand to her face, his fingers brushing her cheek in the lightest of caresses. "Good night, Victoria," he murmured, then turned and led the horses toward the barn. Victoria stood watching him go, her cheek tingling where he had touched it, her heart full of confusion and longing. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting up, eager for details about the dance. Victoria obliged with a recounting of the evening, though she kept certain moments like Knox's touch just now to herself. "And Elizabeth Porter was there, I assume?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "Yes," Victoria confirmed. She seemed quite possessive of Knox, the housekeeper snorted. That one's had her eye on Knox and this ranch for years. Her father's been trying to push them together just as long, thinks his daughter could do worse than a hard-working rancher with good prospects. And what does Knox think? Victoria couldn't help but ask. Mrs. Abernathy gave her a shrewd look. Knox knows a gilded cage when he sees one, but sometimes a man backs himself into a corner where there seems to be only one way out. "You mean the mortgage," Victoria said, understanding dawning. "Mr. Porter could foreclose if Knox can't make the payments," precisely, and with cattle prices what they are. The housekeeper shrugged. "But enough of that. You look tired, child, off to bed with you." That night, Victoria lay awake long after she should have been asleep, thinking about Knox, about the ranch, about her uncertain future. She had come west seeking a new beginning, never imagining it would take this form. Now, just weeks after the stagecoach robbery, she found herself deeply attached to this place and its people, especially its owner. The question was, what did Knox feel for her? And what would happen when it was time for her to leave? The next morning, Victoria woke early but found Knox had already left the house. According to Mrs. Abernathy, he'd ridden out before dawn to check on a sick calf. "He'll be back for dinner," the housekeeper assured her. "Sundays are for rest, even on a ranch." Victoria spent the morning helping with household chores, then retreated to the sitting room with a book. She was deeply engrossed when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window. Knox was returning, but he wasn't alone. Sheriff Jenkins and 2 other men rode beside him, their expressions serious. Victoria hurried to the door, a sense of foreboding settling over her. "What's happened?" she asked as Knox dismounted. His face was grim. "Harlan Reese and his gang, they hit the Miller place last night. Burned the barn, ran off 30 head of cattle." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "Was anyone hurt?" "Thank God, no," Sheriff Jenkins answered. "But they're getting bolder. The Miller's place is just 15 miles from here." Knox turned to the sheriff. "I'll gather my men." "We'll join your posse at first light." Jenkins nodded. "Much obliged, Knox. We'll need every gun we can get." After the sheriff and his deputies had ridden off, Victoria followed Knox to the barn. "You're going after them?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Knox nodded, busy checking his rifle. "I have to. If they're not stopped, every ranch in the county could be next." "Including yours," Victoria said quietly. Knox paused, meeting her eyes. "Including mine, but that's not why I'm going. These are my neighbors, Victoria. Out here we look after each other." Victoria understood, but that didn't ease her fear. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. A few days, maybe a week if we have to track them into the mountains." Knox set down his rifle and moved closer to her. "Mrs. O will be here and Pedro will stay behind to watch over things. You'll be safe." "It's not my safety I'm concerned about," Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something shifted in Knox's expression, a softening, a warming. "Victoria," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. Finally, he reached out and took her hands in his. "I'll come back, I promise." The warmth of his hands, the intensity in his eyes, Victoria felt as if she couldn't breathe. "Knox, boss." Pedro's voice interrupted them as the foreman appeared at the barn door. "Men are gathering at the bunkhouse, waiting for instructions." Knox released Victoria's hands reluctantly. "I'll be right there." As Pedro withdrew, Knox looked back at Victoria. "We'll finish this conversation when I return." Victoria nodded, knowing that whatever this was between them, it had just been acknowledged by both of them. "Be careful," she said softly. Knox's smile was brief but genuine. "Always am." The next morning dawned gray and cold, a light rain falling as Knox and 4 of his ranch hands prepared to join the posse. Victoria stood on the porch, watching as they checked their gear and weapons. Just before they mounted up, Knox approached her one last time. "Remember what I said." "Pedro will keep watch. Stay close to the house." "I will," Victoria promised. "And you remember what I said. Be careful." Knox hesitated then, in full view of his men and Mrs. Abernathy. He leaned forward and pressed a brief, gentle kiss to Victoria's forehead. "For luck," he murmured, then turned and mounted his horse. Victoria touched the spot where his lips had been, watching as Knox and his men rode away into the misty morning, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and something that felt dangerously like love. The days that followed were the longest of Victoria's life. She threw herself into work around the ranch, helping Mrs. Abernathy with canning, assisting Pedro with the care of the horses, even learning to shoot under the foreman's patient instruction. "A woman should know how to protect herself," Pedro said, showing her how to load the small revolver Knox had left for emergencies. "Especially out here." On the 4th day, a rider arrived from town with news. The posse had tracked Reese and his gang to an abandoned mining camp in the foothills. There had been a shootout. One of the outlaws was dead, another captured, but Reese and the 4th man had escaped into the mountains. The posse had split up, half returning to town with the prisoner, half continuing the pursuit. "And Mr. Northwood?" Victoria asked, her heart in her throat. "Fine, last I heard," the rider assured her, leading the group going after Reese. That night, Victoria sat on the porch long after Mrs. Abernathy had gone to bed, staring at the stars and thinking of Knox somewhere in the mountains, tracking dangerous men. The air was cool, and she wrapped his coat left hanging by the door around her shoulders, taking comfort in its familiar scent. On the 6th day, Victoria was in the kitchen kneading bread when she heard horses approaching. She rushed to the window, her heart leaping at the sight of Knox leading his men back to the ranch. They looked tired and dirty, their expressions grim. Victoria ran outside, not caring about propriety or appearances. Knox dismounted stiffly, fatigue evident in every line of his body. There was a bandage on his left arm, stained with old blood. "You're hurt," Victoria said, reaching for him without thinking. Knox caught her hand, his grip firm despite his exhaustion. "It's nothing. Bullet grazed me, that's all." His eyes searched her face. "You're all right." "Of course," Victoria said. "We've been fine. What happened? Did you catch Reese?" Knox shook his head, his expression darkening. "He gave us the slip in the mountains, lost his trail in a storm." He handed the reins of his horse to one of the ranch hands. "We'll talk inside." "I need to clean up first." An hour later, freshly bathed and with a clean bandage on his arm, courtesy of Mrs. Abernathy's ministrations, Knox joined Victoria in the sitting room. He looked better, though still tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than before. "Sheriff Jenkins thinks Reese might have doubled back toward Colorado," he explained, accepting the coffee Victoria offered. "He's telegraphed the authorities there, but—" He shrugged. "Reese knows the country. He could be anywhere by now. So it's not over," Victoria said quietly. "No," Knox admitted. "It's not over. But Reese lost 2 of his men. He'll lie low for a while, regroup." He set down his cup and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Victoria, there's something else, something I need to tell you." The seriousness in his tone made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" Knox took a deep breath. "While we were tracking Reese, we came across evidence that he and his gang were the ones who robbed your stagecoach." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know?" "The prisoner talked, and we found items at their camp that matched the description of what was stolen, including a small jewelry box with the initials VG on it." Hope flared in Victoria's chest. "My mother's jewelry, you found it?" Knox nodded, reaching into his pocket. "Not all of it." "But this was there." He opened his hand to reveal a delicate gold locket. Victoria gasped, taking the locket with trembling fingers. It had been her mother's most treasured possession, containing miniature portraits of Victoria and Edward as children. I never thought I'd see this again, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Open it, Knox said softly. Victoria did, expecting to see the familiar portraits. Instead, she found a small, folded piece of paper. Puzzled, she unfolded it to discover a crudely written message. Tell the woman I'll be seeing her again. HR, Victoria's blood ran cold. He knows about me. How? Knox's expression was grim. The stagecoach manifest would have had your name, and Juniper Creek isn't that big, word gets around. But why would he care about me? I'm nobody to him. You're a witness, Knox said quietly, and Reese doesn't leave witnesses if he can help it. Victoria stared at the threatening note, the joy of recovering her mother's locket now completely overshadowed. What do we do? Knox's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring. First, we don't panic. Reese is on the run, miles from here. Second, we take precautions. You don't go anywhere alone, not even on the ranch property. And third, he hesitated. What? Victoria prompted. I think you should consider leaving. Going somewhere safe until Reese is caught. Victoria felt as if she'd been struck. Leaving? You want me to go? No, Knox said quickly, his hand tightening on hers. God knows that's the last thing I want, but your safety matters more than what I want. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Victoria searched his face, seeing the concern there, but also something deeper, something that made her heart race. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. This is my home now. I won't be driven away by fear. Knox's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been pride, might have been admiration. You're sure? Completely? Victoria lifted her chin, determination replacing fear. Besides, I made a promise to Mrs. Abernathy to help with the apple preserves next week. A slow smile spread across Knox's face, easing the lines of fatigue. Well, we can't disappoint Mrs. A, can we? His expression sobered. But we take precautions, no arguments. No arguments, Victoria agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, his hand still covering hers. Then, with a gentleness that made her breath catch, Knox raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I missed you, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. Out there in the mountains, I kept thinking of you here, waiting. It gave me a reason to come back. Victoria's heart swelled. I missed you too, she admitted. More than I should, perhaps. Knox smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and erased years from his face. There's no should out here, Victoria, only what is. And what was, increasingly, was a bond between them that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. A bond that, despite the looming threat of Harlan Reese, gave Victoria hope for a future she had never imagined. Life at the ranch settled into a new routine in the weeks that followed. True to his word, Knox implemented strict safety measures. Victoria never went anywhere alone, and at least one armed man was always within calling distance of the house. The ranch hands took turns patrolling the property at night, and Knox himself often rode the boundaries, checking for any sign of intruders. Despite these precautions, Victoria refused to live in fear. She continued her work alongside Mrs. Abernathy, learning the seasonal rhythms of ranch life. September brought the apple harvest, and the women spent days preserving the bounty from the small orchard behind the house. Victoria discovered she had a talent for making apple butter, much to Mrs. Abernathy's approval. You're becoming a proper rancher's wife, the housekeeper remarked one afternoon, then quickly added, not that I'm implying anything, of course. Victoria blushed but didn't contradict her. The truth was, her feelings for Knox had deepened with each passing day. And while he had not spoken directly of love, his actions spoke volumes. The way his eyes followed her around a room, the gentle touches as they passed each other, the long conversations by the fire after Mrs. Abernathy had retired for the night, all pointed to a man falling in love. One evening in late September, Knox suggested a ride to the ridge where they had watched the sunset together in what seemed like another lifetime. Victoria eagerly agreed, longing to escape the confines of the ranch yard, if only for a few hours. They rode out in the golden light of late afternoon, Pedro following at a discreet distance. When they reached the ridge, Knox spread a blanket on the ground and produced a small basket. Mrs. A packed us a picnic, he explained, helping Victoria sit. She said we deserved some time alone. Victoria smiled, touched by the housekeeper's thoughtfulness. She's been dropping hints about us for weeks now. Knox chuckled as he unpacked bread, cheese, and a bottle of wine. Subtlety has never been Mrs. A's strong suit. They ate as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink. When they had finished, Knox refilled their wine glasses and moved to sit beside Victoria. "I received a telegram from your uncle yesterday," he said. Victoria turned to him, surprised. "You didn't mention it." "I wanted to wait for the right moment." Knox took a sip of his wine. "He says the rebuilding is going well. They hope to move back to the ranch by the end of October." Oh, Victoria felt a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that her uncle and his family were recovering from the raid. On the other, "That's sooner than I expected." Knox nodded, his expression unreadable. He asked when you might join them. Victoria's heart sank. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. "What did you tell him?" "That it was your decision to make." Knox set down his glass and turned to face her fully. "Victoria, these past months have been, I've never known anything like them. Having you here, watching you become part of the ranch, he hesitated, part of my life. It's changed everything." Victoria held her breath, hardly daring to hope. "Knox, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you came west with a plan, you had a purpose, a place to go. And if you still want that, if you want to join your uncle and teach his children as you intended, I'll respect that. I'll even take you there myself." "And if I don't?" Victoria whispered. Knox reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "If you don't, then I'm asking you to stay. Not as Mrs. Abernathy's helper, not as a guest, but as—" He took a deep breath. "As my wife, if you'll have me." Joy surged through Victoria, so intense it was almost painful. "Knox Northwood, are you proposing to me on a blanket in the middle of nowhere?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose I am. Is that a problem?" Victoria laughed, tears of happiness springing to her eyes. "It's perfect, absolutely perfect. Is that a yes?" Knox asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. In answer, Victoria leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Knox's arms came around her, drawing her closer. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "That's definitely a yes," Victoria said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Knox's smile was radiant. "I love you, Victoria Galloway. I think I have since I found you crying in the dust that day." "And I love you," Victoria replied, the words feeling natural and right. "Though I might have taken a bit longer to realize it." Knox kissed her again, then reached into his pocket. "I have something for you. It's not fancy, but—" He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band. "It was my mother's. I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the courage to ask you." Victoria held out her trembling hand, watching as Knox slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring how it caught the light of the setting sun. They stayed on the ridge until the first stars appeared, talking of their future together, making plans for a simple wedding before winter set in. Knox spoke of improvements he wanted to make to the house, while Victoria shared her ideas for a proper vegetable garden come spring. It was full dark by the time they gathered their things and prepared to return to the ranch. Knox helped Victoria mount her horse, then swung up onto his own. Pedro, who had kept a respectful distance throughout their picnic, rode forward to join them for the journey home. They were halfway down the ridge when a shot rang out, shattering the peaceful night. Pedro cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder. "Ride," Knox shouted to Victoria, drawing his revolver. Back to the ranch now, Victoria hesitated, unwilling to leave them. Another shot whistled past her head, making her horse rear in terror. "Go," Knox ordered again, firing into the darkness toward the source of the shots. This time Victoria obeyed, spurring her horse down the trail toward the distant lights of the ranch. Behind her, she could hear more gunfire, then the sound of hoofbeats in pursuit. Heart pounding, she bent low over her horse's neck, urging the animal to greater speed. She was within sight of the ranch when a rider cut across her path, forcing her horse to skid to a halt. In the moonlight, she could make out a scarred face beneath a dirty hat. Miss Galloway, I presume, the man said, his voice as cold as the barrel of the gun he pointed at her. Harlan Reese, at your service. Terror froze Victoria's blood. What do you want? Reese's smile was chilling. Originally, just to eliminate a witness. But now I hear you're engaged to Northwood. That changes things. He gestured with his gun. Dismount, slowly. Victoria complied, her mind racing. The ranch was so close, if she could just delay him, someone might hear, might come to help. What do you mean it changes things? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Reese chuckled. Northwood's been a thorn in my side for years, too righteous to look the other way when cattle go missing, too respected to intimidate, but now… He leveled the gun at her heart. Now he has a weakness. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth if you harm me, Victoria said, with more confidence than she felt. Counting on it, Reese replied. But first, we're going to take a little ride. My associate will leave a message telling Northwood exactly where to find you. And when he comes alone, with $5,000, I'll consider letting you both live. A second rider emerged from the shadows, and Victoria recognized him as the fourth member of Reese's gang, the one who had escaped with him into the mountains. The realization that they had been watching the ranch, waiting for an opportunity, made her sick with fear. And if he doesn't come alone? Victoria asked, playing for time. Reese shrugged. Then I'll send him your pretty finger with that new ring on it, maybe an ear next. He gestured toward his companion. Tie her hands and get her on your horse. We need to be long gone before Northwood gets back. As the second man dismounted and approached her with a length of rope, Victoria knew she had seconds to act. Remembering Pedro's shooting lessons, she suddenly dropped to the ground, rolled, and came up with the small revolver Knox had given her, which she'd kept hidden in her boot. She fired once, hitting the approaching outlaw in the chest. He fell with a surprised grunt, the rope still clutched in his hands. Before Reese could react, Victoria swung the gun toward him and pulled the trigger again. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber, Reese's face contorted with rage. You'll pay for that, bitch, he snarled, raising his own weapon. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Reese's gun. The outlaw jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face before he toppled from his horse. Victoria turned to see Knox galloping toward her, rifle in hand. Behind him rode several of the ranch hands, alerted by the gunfire. Knox leapt from his horse while it was still moving, rushing to Victoria's side. Are you hurt? He demanded, his hands moving over her as if to reassure himself she was whole. No, Victoria said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. No, I'm fine. Is Pedro alive? Knox assured her. Shot in the shoulder, but he'll recover. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured into her hair. Victoria clung to him, the reality of what had just happened, what she had done, beginning to sink in. I killed a man, she whispered. Knox drew back just enough to look into her face. You defended yourself. And likely saved more lives than your own. He cupped her face in his hands. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Victoria Galloway. The ranch hands had dismounted and were examining the bodies of Reese and his companion. Boss, one called. Reese is still breathing. Barely. Knox nodded grimly. Get him to town. The doctor can tend him until the sheriff takes over. He turned back to Victoria. Let's get you home. The following days passed in a blur. Sheriff Jenkins came to take Victoria's statement about the shootout. Pedro was recovering well under Mrs. Abernathy's care, and Harlan Reese, despite the doctor's efforts, died of his wounds without regaining consciousness. It's over, Knox told Victoria as they sat before the fire on the third night after the attack. Really over this time. Victoria nodded, still processing everything that had happened. The nightmares had started the night after the shooting, vivid dreams where she fired the gun again and again, sometimes at Reese, sometimes at faceless strangers. Knox had been there each time she woke, holding her, whispering reassurances until she calmed. I keep thinking about how close we came to losing everything, she admitted. Just when we'd found each other. Knox took her hand, his thumb stroking over the ring on her finger. But we didn't lose. You saw to that. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with such love it took her breath away. I'm not sure I deserve you, Victoria Galloway, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to. Victoria leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. When can we be married? She asked. I don't want to wait, Knox smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. As soon as you like. The minister can come to the ranch this Sunday if you want, or we can go to town, make it a proper celebration. Victoria considered this. The ranch, she decided. This is our home. I want to start our life together here. And so, on a crisp October Sunday, Victoria Galloway and Knox Northwood were married in the sitting room of the ranch house. Mrs. Abernathy cried openly throughout the ceremony, while Pedro, his arm in a sling, stood as Knox's best man. A few close neighbors attended, along with Sheriff Jenkins and, somewhat surprisingly, Elizabeth Porter, who approached Victoria after the ceremony. I owe you an apology, Elizabeth said stiffly. I was unkind when you first arrived. I thought you were just passing through, that you wouldn't understand our ways or appreciate what Knox has built here. Victoria smiled, too happy to hold grudges. And now I see that you belong here more than I ever could. Elizabeth glanced at Knox, who was accepting congratulations from the sheriff. He was never going to choose me, was he? I don't think it was a matter of choosing, Victoria said gently. Some things are just meant to be. Elizabeth nodded, something like understanding in her eyes. Be happy, Mrs. Northwood, both of you. With that, she turned and left, her head held high. That night, as Victoria lay in Knox's arms in what was now their bedroom, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terrified, grieving woman crying in the dust of the Wyoming prairie to the confident rancher's wife who had faced down outlaws to protect what she loved. What are you thinking? Knox asked, his voice a rumble beneath her ear where it rested on his chest. That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Victoria replied, lifting her head to look at him. That sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best. Knox smiled, pulling her closer. Those tears belong in my hands now, he murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken when they first met. But so do your smiles, your laughter, your love. Forever, Victoria promised, sealing the vow with a kiss, and as the years passed, that promise held true. Victoria and Knox built a life together on the ranch, weathering droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations, and the occasional rustler. They welcomed their first child, a daughter, the following autumn, and a son 2 years later. The house expanded along with their family, adding rooms and a proper garden where Victoria grew not just vegetables, but flowers, bright splashes of color against the backdrop of the prairie. Mrs. Abernathy stayed with them until her peaceful passing in her sleep at the age of 78. Pedro eventually became the ranch foreman, training a new generation of cowboys in the Northwood way of doing things. Victoria's uncle and his family thrived at their rebuilt ranch, and the cousins grew up considering themselves more like siblings, traveling back and forth between the two properties for holidays and special occasions. And on warm summer evenings, Knox and Victoria would sometimes ride to the ridge where he had proposed, spread a blanket, and watch the sunset together. Sometimes they spoke of the future, the children's education, improvements to the ranch, the changing face of the West as the frontier gradually disappeared. Other times they reminisced about the past, how a chance encounter on a dusty road had changed both their lives forever. But mostly they simply sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's hearts as well as their own, who had faced death and danger side by side, and who had built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their former lives. On one such evening, as they celebrated their 20th anniversary, Knox took Victoria's hand the same way he had on the day he proposed. The years had added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes were as blue and clear as ever when they met hers. Any regrets? He asked, a question he posed every year on this day, and Victoria, as always, shook her head and smiled. Not a single one, she replied, and kissed him as the sun set over their land, their home, their life together. For the woman who had once been found crying in the dust had long since learned that tears, like hearts, sometimes find their rightful place in the most unexpected of hands.